A poor boy saved the life of a dying millionaire. The next day, the boy was unexpectedly the one who has to be hospitalized. The wind whipped against Gerald Sanders' face, biting cold, as if it carried a vendetta of its own. Without the chill, his fingers trembled as he gripped the bridge's metal railing, weighing his decision. Below, the Chicago River snaked through the city, black and indifferent, its surface reflecting faint streaks of light from the towering skyline above. The city was alive, pulsing, uncaring, and here he was, suspended between it and the abyss. Gerald exhaled slowly, the sound ragged against the stillness. A faint fog curled from his breath, dissipating into the air just as Ryan's laughter once had. Brief, bright, and irretrievable. He didn't need to close his eyes to see his son's face. It etched itself into every part of him, sharper than ever. 7 years old, a mop of untamed hair, and eyes so full of mischief they could convince you the world was still a place worth staying in. The crash had been a symphony of horror. Metal screaming, glass shattering, the guttural sob of someone shouting a name. Ryan's name. Gerald awoke to stark hospital lights, Mary's silent, tear-streaked face, and the unbearable weight of a truth that crushed everything else. Ryan had gone, and it was his fault. He'd insisted they leave the party early. He'd been the one driving. A car honked in the distance, breaking the quiet. Gerald flinched. His knuckles whitened on the railing. In the years since Ryan's death, nothing had filled the silence. It was not the empty house that had filled the silence, not the hollow apologies between him and Mary that had slowly eroded into silence, not even the endless grind of his business, a fortress of wealth built to shield him from the pain. "Enough," he whispered, the word barely audible. He glanced down again, the water beckoning like a promise of reprieve. It would be quick, clean. Perhaps then, forgiveness could come his way. "Hey!" A small voice broke through the night, startling him enough that he swayed slightly on the edge. He spun around, his heart pounding. A boy stood a few feet away, bundled in a too-thin coat, his face pale and pinched from the cold. He had matted dark hair and unevenly laced shoes. There was a fragility about him, like a gust of wind might shatter him entirely. "Are you okay?" the boy asked, his voice tentative but steady. He didn't move closer, his wide eyes fixed on Gerald with something between fear and concern. Gerald's breath caught. The boy couldn't have been more than 7, the same age as Ryan. His stomach twisted. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "It's late." "So should you," the boy countered quietly, his words carrying a conviction that startled Gerald. He took a hesitant step forward. Are you going to jump?" The directness made Gerald flinch. He looked away, unable to meet the boy's gaze. "You don't understand. Just go home." The boy ignored him, taking another step. The cold caused his hands to tremble and his lips to chap. "I don't have a home," he admitted, his voice cracking. "But you don't look like you should be here either." Gerald's heart sank further. He wanted to tell the boy to leave, to spare him the sight of whatever came next. Instead, he found himself asking, "What's your name?" "Jordan," the boy said. His eyes dropped to the ground. "My dad, he's in the hospital. They say he might not make it." Something inside Gerald shifted, a faint crack in the wall he'd built around himself. "Your dad?" he asked, his voice softer now. Jordan nodded. "He told me to be strong no matter what. That's why I'm here. I am here to be strong. And I thought maybe—" He trailed off, looking back at Gerald, his gaze piercing. "Maybe you need to be strong too." The boy's words struck like a physical blow. Gerald turned his gaze to the city, unable to meet Jordan's stare. His mind raced. The boy's trembling frame, his quiet resolve. There was something achingly familiar about it. It stirred a memory, not of Ryan, but of himself. He was young, hopeful, and desperate to fight for something. "I don't know if I can," Gerald murmured, almost to himself. "You can," Jordan said simply. "If I can, you can." Gerald swallowed hard, his throat burning. He looked back at the boy, studying him. Jordan wasn't just asking for himself. He was offering something, a thread to cling to. Gerald felt his grip on the railing loosen. "Come on," Jordan said, extending a hand, small and shaking. "It's cold." Gerald hesitated for a long moment before finally stepping down from the railing. His shoes hit the pavement with a weight that felt unfamiliar, almost grounding. The boy offered a small, trembling smile, one that Gerald found himself returning, despite the storm inside him. "Let's get you somewhere warm," Gerald said. And just like that, the void didn't seem so absolute. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the cracked vinyl booths and scratched tabletops. It was the kind of place that thrived on anonymity, a transient stop for weary travelers and lonely souls. Gerald Sanders pushed the door open, holding it just long enough for Jordan to shuffle inside. The boy hesitated on the threshold, his eyes darting around the room like a stray animal, unsure if it would be welcomed or chased away. "Come on," Gerald said gruffly, gesturing toward a booth near the corner. The boy's hesitation lingered, but the promise of warmth eventually won. He slid into the seat opposite Gerald, his small frame barely making a dent in the cracked cushion. A waitress approached, her pen poised over a grease-stained notepad. She was middle-aged, her worn eyes scanning the duo with practiced indifference. "Coffee?" she asked, her tone clipped. "For me," Gerald muttered, glancing at Jordan. "And something warm for him." "Hot chocolate?" Her gaze softened as she took in the boy's worn coat and hollow cheeks. Jordan nodded, his lips twitching into the faintest semblance of a smile. "Thank you." The waitress lingered for a second longer, then turned and disappeared into the kitchen. Gerald leaned back in his seat, studying Jordan under the dim light. The boy's hair was a tangled mess, his skin pale and almost translucent. His hands rested on the table, small and chapped, with dirt stubbornly embedded beneath his fingernails. "You said your dad's in the hospital," Gerald began, his voice steady but distant. "What's wrong with him?" Jordan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "It's something with his blood," he said carefully, as if the words themselves were fragile. "They said it's genetic. He got sick last year and then I too began experiencing constant fatigue. They said I might have it, but it's not as bad." Gerald frowned. "They didn't treat you?" Jordan shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "They gave me medicine. They told me I didn't need anything else yet. The focus has to be on my dad. He's worse." Gerald detected a tremor beneath the boy's even, matter-of-fact voice. There was no self-pity, just an acceptance that felt far too mature for someone so young. "Where's your mum?" Gerald asked, his tone softer now. "She left when I was little. It's just been me and Dad." Jordan glanced out the window, his reflection barely visible against the darkness outside. He always said we're a team, that no matter what, we'd stick together. The words hung in the air, unspoken memories of Gerald's own fractured family weaving through them. He shifted uncomfortably, the booth suddenly feeling too small. "Sounds like he's a decent man," he said finally. Jordan nodded. "He is. He always tells me to keep going, even when it's hard. That's what teams do, right?" Gerald didn't answer immediately. The boy's quiet optimism gnawed at the edges of his cynicism, an unwelcome reminder of the person he used to be, before the accident, before the silence, before he'd let despair hollow him out. "Why were you on that bridge?" Jordan's unexpected question took Gerald by surprise. He stiffened, his gaze snapping to the boy's face. Jordan's gaze remained focused on the worn table as he traced invisible patterns with his fingertip. The innocence of the question stung more than any accusation. "I, don't know," Gerald admitted after a long pause. "I guess I thought it was the only way to make the pain stop." Jordan looked up then, his eyes wide and searching. "But what about the people who care about you? What would they do?" The question cut through him sharply. Gerald swallowed hard, unable to meet the boy's gaze. "There aren't many left." "That's not true," Jordan said quietly, but with surprising firmness. "You cared about me. You brought me here. That means something." The waitress returned, setting a steaming mug of hot chocolate in front of Jordan and a chipped coffee cup in front of Gerald. The interruption gave Gerald a moment to compose himself, but the boy's words lingered, unshakable. Jordan wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. His pale face brightened slightly, though his breathing seemed more labored now. He sipped cautiously, his shoulders visibly relaxing. "You're stronger than you think," Jordan said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "You just forgot." Before Gerald could respond, Jordan swayed, his eyes fluttering shut as the mug slipped from his hands. It hit the table with a dull thud, spilling chocolate across the scratched surface. "Jordan?" Gerald's voice rose, sharp with alarm. He moved quickly, catching the boy as he slumped sideways, his body unnaturally hot to the touch. "Help!" Gerald called out, his voice slicing through the quiet din of the diner. The waitress turned, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. Gerald didn't wait for a response. He scooped Jordan into his arms, the boy's fragile frame light as a whisper, and bolted toward the door. The icy Chicago air hit him like a slap, but all he could focus on was the shallow rise and fall of Jordan's chest, the sterile scent of antiseptic and the hum of subdued chaos. Nurses hurried by, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum. He held Jordan tightly, the boy's frail body limp and alarmingly warm in his arms. "Help! I need help!" Gerald barked, his voice cutting through the murmur of the waiting room. A nurse at the reception desk glanced up, startled, before snapping into action. "This way," she called, gesturing toward a nearby corridor. Gerald followed as she led him to a triage room. A flurry of movement surrounded them almost instantly, hands reaching to take Jordan, voices asking rapid-fire questions. Gerald hesitated for a moment, reluctant to let go, but the urgency in the nurse's eyes forced him to relinquish the boy. "What happened?" another nurse asked as they placed Jordan on a gurney. "He collapsed," Gerald managed, his throat tight. "He said he wasn't feeling well then. He just fainted." The nurse nodded, her attention already shifting to the monitors. "We'll take it from here, sir." As the medical team wheeled Jordan away, Gerald stood frozen in the hallway, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. The adrenaline that had propelled him here was ebbing, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he felt responsible. This boy, this stranger, had somehow become tethered to him. "Sir?" A voice broke through his daze. The same nurse from earlier held out a clipboard. "We need some information. Can you fill out what you know?" Gerald took the clipboard and pen, retreating to the waiting area. His hands trembled slightly as he scanned the form. Name, age, emergency contact. He realized how little he knew about Jordan. His father's name. What was it? Russell, Jordan had mentioned earlier, almost casually, as if the name alone held everything Gerald needed to know. Gerald's hand froze mid-stroke. Russell. The name hit him like a physical blow. stirring memories buried deep beneath the weight of decades. His childhood best friend, the boy who had stood by him through scraped knees and broken rules, who had vanished from his life without warning. Could it be the same Russell? His breath caught as the memories came rushing back. Summers spent racing bikes through dirt paths, secret handshakes shared under the shade of an old oak tree. Russell's crooked grin was evident when they were caught stealing apples from Mrs. Carmichael's orchard. They vowed to remain brothers forever, regardless of the circumstances. But forever hadn't lasted long. Gerald's family had moved across town during his sophomore year of high school, and the distance, both physical and emotional, had widened until it became insurmountable. There was no falling out or betrayal, just the quiet erosion of a bond neither could properly maintain. Gerald had often wondered what had become of Russell, but had never sought him out, too consumed by the demands of adulthood. Now, as he sat in the hospital waiting room's stark fluorescent light, Gerald experienced a wave of regret so intense that it nearly brought him to tears. He looked back at the form, scribbling down the name with a shaking hand. "Russell," he murmured, testing the weight of it aloud. The sound of distant footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. A nurse approached, her expression professional but kind. "Mr. Sanders, the boy is stable for now, but he's running a high fever. We're doing everything we can." Gerald nodded, relief washing over him, though it did little to quiet the questions swirling in his mind. "What about his father, Russell?" The nurse's brow furrowed briefly, then cleared. "He's here. Room 312. Are you a relative?" Gerald hesitated. The truth felt too complicated to explain. "I'm a friend of the family," he said finally. The nurse nodded. "You can visit him. He's unconscious but stable." Gerald rose slowly, his limbs heavy as if weighed down by the gravity of what he was about to face. He walked down the hallway, the fluorescent lights above casting harsh shadows against the white walls. His footsteps echoed, each one a reminder of the years that had passed since he'd last seen Russell. When he reached room 312, he paused outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle. A mixture of apprehension and anticipation churned in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected to find: a ghost from his past, a stranger, or something in between. Taking a deep breath, Gerald pushed the door open. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. Russell lay motionless on the hospital bed, his once vibrant face pale and lined with age and exhaustion. Tubes snaked from his arms to machines that hummed softly in the background. Gerald stepped closer, his throat tightening. Despite the years, despite the wear of illness, the face before him was unmistakably Russell's. The crooked grin was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural, but the familiarity was undeniable. "Russell," Gerald whispered, the name catching in his throat. For a moment he simply stood there, the weight of their shared past pressing down on him. He had found his old friend, but the circumstances felt unbearably cruel. And yet, there was something else, a flicker of determination that he hadn't felt in years. Gerald pulled up a chair beside the bed, his resolve solidifying. Whatever came next, he wouldn't walk away. This time, he refused to give up. The dim glow of the monitors illuminated the room in rhythmic pulses, their beeping an unyielding reminder of how precariously Russell's life hung in the balance. Gerald sat stiffly in the chair beside the bed, the scent of antiseptic sharp and intrusive, as if to force him into acknowledging the reality before him. Russell's face was gaunt, his skin paper-thin and waxy under the pale hospital lighting. The wiry teenager Gerald once knew, the one with a knack for charm and an infectious laugh, was gone. In his place lay a man crushed by time and illness, tethered to life by machines and willpower alone. Gerald leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. His mind wandered to the summers of their youth, when he and Russell were inseparable. He remembered the sunlight streaming through the trees as they raced their bikes down dusty trails, laughing so hard they could barely breathe. Russell had always been the fearless one, quick to climb the tallest tree or leap across a rushing creek. Gerald had admired that about him, the way he seemed invincible. But nothing was invincible, not even Russell. "Excuse me," a voice snapped Gerald back to the present. He turned to see a nurse standing in the doorway, her expression a careful balance of professionalism and skepticism. "Are you family?" Gerald straightened, his voice firm. "I'm a friend, an old friend." The nurse hesitated, her eyes flickering to Russell's unconscious form. "You should know. There's been talk. People are wondering why you're here, why you're so involved." "What people?" Gerald asked sharply, his tone bristling with the kind of authority he rarely used anymore. The nurse hesitated, her posture stiffening. "There's concern that you're being manipulated. The boy, Jordan, and his father, well, some think they might see your generosity as an opportunity." Gerald's jaw clenched. Manipulated. He rose to his feet, the weight of the accusation igniting a fire within him. "Do you think this is straightforward for them? That a sick man and his son are plotting to advantage of a stranger when they're barely holding on to their lives?" "I didn't mean to imply," she began, but Gerald cut her off. "I've known Russell since we were kids. If he's in this bed, it's because life kicked him harder than he deserved, not because he planned it. And that boy, Jordan, has more courage than most adults I know. So, no, I don't believe they're manipulating me. I believe they're surviving." The nurse looked away, chastened, before nodding curtly. "I'll make sure you're not disturbed." Gerald sank back into his chair, his pulse pounding as she left. He hadn't realized how fiercely protective he'd become of Russell and Jordan until now. The idea that anyone could doubt their integrity felt like an insult to everything he'd seen and felt in the last 24 hours. His gaze returned to Russell, and for a moment, he allowed himself to wonder. What had life been like for him? What had happened after their paths diverged? There was so much he didn't know, and now, looking at his friend's fragile form, he feared he might never get the chance to ask. "I'm sorry," Gerald murmured, his voice low and filled with regret. "I should have tried harder. I should have found you before it got to this." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Gerald turned to see a doctor entering, clipboard in hand. The man's expression was neutral, but his eyes betrayed the weight of difficult conversations he'd had to deliver that day. "Mr. Sanders," the doctor asked, "I understand you're here for Mr. Russell and his son." "Yes," Gerald replied, standing again. "How is he?" The doctor sighed, flipping through the chart. "Russell is stable for now, but his condition is critical. He has a rare blood disorder that's progressed significantly. We're doing what we can to keep him comfortable, but—" He hesitated, meeting Gerald's gaze directly. "It's a fight we don't expect him to win." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Gerald felt his stomach churn, but he kept his composure. "And Jordan? Jordan's condition is less severe. He has the same disorder, but he's in the early stages. If treated aggressively, there's a decent chance he'll recover." Gerald nodded, his mind racing. He thanked the doctor, though the words felt hollow, and watched him leave. The room fell silent again, save for the beeping machines. Looking at Russell, Gerald felt a surge of determination, unlike anything he'd known in years. He thought of Ryan, his son, whose life he couldn't save, of Mary, and the unspoken blame that had driven them apart. And now, Jordan, whose eyes carried the same quiet resilience that Ryan's once had. This was his chance. This was his opportunity to make a difference. The goal is to make a difference. "I won't let you down," Gerald whispered, his voice steady. He reached for Russell's hand, clasping it gently but firmly, as if to anchor them both in the unspoken promise he'd just made. He didn't know what came next, but one thing was clear. He wouldn't walk away. Not from Russell, not from Jordan, not from this second chance to do what was right. The machines beeped steadily, an unyielding metronome to Gerald's resolve. The phone call came late in the evening, as Gerald sat slumped in the sterile waiting room, his head in his hands. The vibration startled him, the harsh sound cutting through the hum of fluorescent lights. He fumbled for his phone, glancing at the screen. Mary. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the green button. It had been months since they'd last spoken, strained exchanges laced with words neither of them dared to say. He inhaled sharply and answered. "Gerald." Her voice cracked on the other end. I heard. About everything. Are you okay?" Her concern was palpable, but so was the anxiety, the unresolved grief hanging between them like a heavy curtain. "I'm managing," Gerald replied, his tone cautious. The truth felt too complicated to share in a few words. "How did you find out?" "Your sister called me," Mary admitted, her voice softening. "She said you've been struggling. Gerald, why didn't you tell me?" He let the question hang in the air, unsure how to answer. How could he explain the suffocating guilt, the weight of Ryan's death that had driven them apart? Instead, he redirected. "Mary, I need to tell you something about what's been happening here." There was a pause, and then her hesitant reply. "Go on." Gerald leaned back, staring at the ceiling as he recounted everything. The boy on the bridge, Jordan, Russell. How a chance encounter had unraveled decades of buried memories and thrust him into a situation he couldn't walk away from. As he spoke, Mary remained silent, her breathing steady but strained. When he finished, the line was quiet for several beats. At last, her voice rose to a barely audible whisper. "Russell," she said, testing the name. "Your friend from before?" "Yes," Gerald confirmed. "And his son, Jordan. He reminds me of Ryan, Mary. The way he fights, the way he refuses to give up." Another long pause. "Where are you?" she asked. "At the hospital. Russell's condition is critical, and Jordan, he needs someone." Gerald hesitated, unsure of how she'd respond. "I think he needs you." Mary arrived the next morning, stepping into the hospital's fluorescent-lit lobby with visible trepidation. Her coat was too thin for the biting Chicago winter, her face pale and drawn. Gerald spotted her immediately and rose from the waiting area. "Gerald," she greeted, her voice tight. Her gaze flickered over him, taking in the unshaven stubble and the exhaustion etched into his features. "It's been a while." Gerald answered in a measured tone. "It has." The polite civility between them felt foreign, a stark contrast to the intimacy they once shared. "Thanks for coming." She nodded, her arms folding tightly across her chest. "Where's Jordan?" "Upstairs. I'll take you." They walked in silence through the maze of sterile hallways, the only sound the steady tap of Mary's boots against the linoleum. When they reached the room, Mary hesitated outside the door. Gerald watched her carefully, unsure what she'd feel when she saw the boy who had so quickly become a fixture in his life. When she stepped inside, Jordan was awake, sitting up in bed with a blanket draped around his narrow shoulders. His face brightened at the sight of Gerald, but his expression turned cautious as he noticed Mary. "Jordan," Gerald said gently, stepping forward. "This is Mary. She's someone dear to me. She wanted to meet you." Mary approached slowly, her eyes softening as she took in the boy's fragile frame and wide, curious eyes. "If you've heard this far and want to send well wishes to Jordan and everyone else who's listening, leave a comment, flower, below. This sounds ideal for today." "Hi, Jordan," she said, her voice warm but trembling slightly. "It's wonderful to meet you." Jordan nodded shyly, clutching the edge of his blanket. "Hi." Mary sat in the chair beside his bed, her movements tentative at first, but as the minutes passed, her natural warmth took over. She adjusted the blanket around Jordan's shoulders, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm as she asked him about his favorite foods, his favorite shows. Gradually, the boy's initial wariness faded, replaced by the faintest hint of a smile. Gerald watched from the corner of the room, his chest tightening at the scene before him. It was so painfully familiar. Mary's nurturing instincts, the way she leaned in slightly when she spoke, her quiet strength. For a moment, he could almost imagine they were back in their own home, with Ryan sitting between them, his laughter filling the room. But Ryan wasn't here, and this wasn't their home. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on him, grounding him in the present. When Mary looked up, her gaze met Gerald's, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude. Pain. A shared understanding of what had been lost, and what could still be saved. "I'll help," Mary said softly, turning back to Jordan. She reached for the glass of water on the bedside table, holding it steady as he sipped. "Whatever he needs, I'll help." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a promise. Gerald nodded, his throat tightening. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't facing the world alone. As they left Jordan's room later that afternoon, the tension between Gerald and Mary lingered, but it had softened into something more bearable. They walked side by side down the hospital corridor, neither speaking until they reached the exit. "Thank you," Gerald said finally, his voice low. Mary glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. It's going to be hard. For all of us." Gerald nodded. "I know." For a moment, they stood in silence, the cold Chicago air filtering through the automatic doors. Then Mary turned to leave, her coat billowing slightly in the wind. Gerald watched her go, a mix of hope and uncertainty settling in his chest. The faint beeping of the monitors was a constant presence in Russell's room, a metronome marking the slow passage of time. Gerald sat beside the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The light from the window filtered weakly through the blinds, casting pale stripes across Russell's gaunt face. Gerald's thoughts drifted, as they often did, to the summers of their youth. Russell had always been the daring one, the one who coaxed Gerald into adventures that bordered on reckless. Now, the man before him was a pale shadow of that boy, his frame frail, his features sunken, yet still unmistakably Russell. A soft groan broke through the quiet, and Gerald's head snapped up. Russell's eyelids fluttered, and his fingers twitched weakly against the white hospital sheet. "Russell?" Gerald leaned forward, his voice tentative, as if he might scare his old friend back into unconsciousness. Russell's eyes opened slowly, their clarity dulled by exhaustion and pain. It took a moment before recognition dawned, and his lips curved into the faintest semblance of a smile. "Gerald," he murmured, his voice a rasp. Gerald swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "It's me," he said softly. "It's been a while." Russell's gaze wandered around the room before returning to Gerald. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said haltingly. "I didn't either," Gerald admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I should have looked for you sooner. I should have been here." Russell shook his head weakly. Life. It happens. You've got your own battles. His eyes flickered toward the window, as if the Chicago skyline might offer some solace. But you're here now. That's what matters. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of unspoken apologies hanging between them. Gerald wanted to express more, to bridge the chasm that years of absence had created, but the words became stuck in his throat. Instead, he reached out, placing a hand over Russell's frail one. I'm not leaving this time, Gerald said firmly. I'm here for you, for Jordan. At the mention of his son, Russell's expression softened. He's all I have left, he uttered, his voice barely audible. Promise me. You'll take care of him. You don't have to ask, Gerald replied, his grip tightening. He's a remarkable kid, Russell. You've done an incredible job. The door creaked open, and a nurse entered, her expression gentle but purposeful. I need to check his vitals, she said quietly, glancing at Gerald. Russell's eyes fluttered shut again, the brief burst of energy fading as quickly as it had come. Gerald stepped aside, watching as the nurse adjusted the monitors. When she finished, she turned to Gerald, her tone hesitant. Mr. Sanders, there's a meeting with the pediatric specialist about Jordan's treatment options. You should be there. The small conference room felt oppressively sterile, its walls bare except for a poster advocating flu shots. Gerald sat beside Mary, who had arrived minutes earlier, her presence a quiet but steadying force. Across the table, the specialist laid out the plan for Jordan. The experimental treatment in Switzerland has shown promising results, the doctor explained, her tone measured. Jordan's condition is still in the early stages, which increases his chances of a full recovery. However, time is critical. We'll need to arrange his transfer within the next week. Mary's hand tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Gerald stole a glance at her, noting the tension in her jaw. She didn't speak, but he could feel the weight of her thoughts. What about Russell? Gerald asked, his voice low. The doctor hesitated, her expression tinged with sympathy. His condition is advanced. At this stage, the focus is on keeping him comfortable. Gerald nodded, though the words landed like a blow. He glanced at Mary, who finally spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. If Jordan has a chance, we have to take it. The meeting ended, leaving Gerald and Mary to navigate the maze of emotions the conversation had stirred. As they walked back toward Jordan's room, Gerald's thoughts churned. How would Jordan react to the news? Could he handle the idea of leaving his father behind? Jordan sat cross-legged on the bed, flipping through a battered comic book. His face brightened when Gerald and Mary entered, though the shadow of fatigue lingered in his features. "How's my dad?" he asked, his tone careful, as if bracing for terrible news. "He's resting," Gerald said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Jordan, we need to talk about something important." The boy's small hands clutched the comic tighter. "What is it?" Mary knelt beside him, her voice soft. "There's a treatment for you, Jordan, in Switzerland. It could help you get better." Jordan's eyes widened, and he looked between them. "But what about Dad? I can't leave him. He needs me." Gerald placed a reassuring hand on Jordan's shoulder. "Your dad wants you to go. He told me himself. He wants you to have a chance at a full life." Tears welled in Jordan's eyes, but he blinked them away, his jaw tightening. "I don't want to leave him alone." Mary's voice broke the silence. "You won't be alone, Jordan. We'll make sure he has everything he needs, and when you're better, you'll come back to him." The boy nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he absorbed the weight of their words. Gerald ruffled his hair gently, a gesture that felt strangely natural. "You're stronger than you think," Gerald said, his voice steady. "And we're going to make sure you get through this." As Jordan settled back against the pillows, exhaustion overtaking him, Gerald exchanged a glance with Mary. They didn't need to speak. The resolve in her eyes mirrored his own. Together, they would see this through. The light in Russell's room was dimmed to a soft glow, casting long shadows across the walls. The faint hum of machines filled the air, broken only by the steady rhythm of his breathing. Gerald sat beside him, shoulders hunched, hands clasped in his lap, as if holding on to an invisible thread. Russell's eyes fluttered open, his gaze hazy, but intent. "Gerald," Russell croaked, his voice a mere rasp. "We need to talk." Gerald leaned forward, his heart tightening. "I'm here. What is it?" Russell turned his head slightly, his frail body barely shifting beneath the covers. "Jordan," he began, pausing to catch his breath. "He's got a chance. You have to make sure he takes it." "You don't need to ask me that," Gerald said firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Russell's lips curved into a faint, bitter-sweet smile. "You don't understand. It's not just about the treatment. It's about being there. For him." He closed his eyes briefly, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. "He's going to need someone when I'm gone." Gerald's breath caught in his throat. "Russell, don't argue with me," Russell interrupted, his tone sharper than expected. He opened his eyes again, their intensity undiminished despite his weakened state. "I've made my peace. My time's running out, and that's okay. But Jordan, he has his whole life ahead of him. He deserves to live it." The weight of Russell's words settled heavily on Gerald. "I'll take care of him," he promised, his voice steady. "I'll make sure he's safe, that he has everything he needs." Russell's expression softened, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "You were always the one I could count on," he murmured, "even after all these years." Gerald looked down at his hands, guilt prickling at the edges of his resolve. "I should have been there sooner. I should have—" "Stop," Russell said, cutting him off. "There's no point in looking back. You're here now. That's what matters." The room fell silent, the conversation hanging between them like an unfinished symphony. Gerald wanted to say more, to ease the burden of regret that had followed him for years, but the words refused to come. Later that day, Gerald and Mary sat in Jordan's room, the air heavy with anticipation. Jordan sat cross-legged on the bed, his small frame dwarfed by the blankets wrapped around him. His comic book lay forgotten at his side as he looked up at Gerald and Mary, his expression guarded. "Jordan," Gerald began, his voice soft but firm. "We've got some news. About your treatment." Jordan's eyes widened slightly, and he straightened. "Is it going to happen?" "Yes," Mary interjected gently. "There's a facility in Switzerland that can help you. They're ready to take you as soon as we can arrange it." Jordan's face lit up momentarily, but the joy was quickly replaced by worry. "But what about Dad?" Gerald exchanged a glance with Mary before answering. "Your dad wants you to go. He made me promise to make sure you get this chance." Tears welled in Jordan's eyes, and he shook his head. "I can't leave him. What if something happens?" Mary knelt beside him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Jordan, your dad loves you more than anything. He wants you to have a future. And we'll take care of him here. You won't be leaving him alone." Jordan clutched the blanket tightly, his small hands trembling. "But what if I don't come back in time?" Gerald reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Jordan's shoulder. "You will. You're strong, Jordan. And when you come back, you'll be healthy. That's what your dad wants. That's what he needs." Jordan's lip quivered, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. "I don't want to lose him," he whispered. Mary wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. "You won't lose him, sweetheart. He'll always be with you, no matter what." After a long silence, Jordan nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll go." Mary reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope, handing it to Jordan. "Your dad wanted you to have this," she said softly. Jordan stared at the envelope for a moment before taking it, his hands trembling. He held it close to his chest as if it were a lifeline. "I'll keep it safe," he promised, his voice barely audible. Gerald and Mary exchanged a look, their unspoken agreement solidifying. Together, they would make sure Jordan's journey wasn't in vain. As they watched the boy clutch the letter tightly, Gerald felt a flicker of hope, a fragile but vital light in the shadow of the present. The clock was ticking for Russell, but for Jordan, the future still held a glimmer of promise. Gerald vowed to do everything in his power to make sure that promise was fulfilled. The airport terminal buzzed with muted activity, the hum of distant conversations, the rolling wheels of suitcases, and the faint announcements echoing from overhead speakers. Gerald stood with Jordan near the gate, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. Jordan clutched a small backpack, his other hand gripping the envelope Russell had given him so tightly it was crumpled at the edges. "You sure you've got everything?" Gerald asked, his voice softer than usual. Jordan nodded without looking up. "Yeah," he murmured, his tone distant. His gaze remained fixed on the envelope, as though it might slip away if he let go. Mary was a few steps away, her arms crossed against the chill of the air conditioning. Her eyes lingered on Jordan, and Gerald could tell her thoughts mirrored his own. Ryan. Their son had stood just like this once, small, uncertain, trying to look braver than he felt. The memory clawed at his chest, vivid and raw. "It's time to board," Mary said gently, breaking the silence. The journey to Switzerland was lengthy, with the hours seemingly elongated. Jordan sat by the window, staring out at the endless expanse of clouds. He said little, his small frame tucked into the oversized airline seat. Gerald, seated beside him, watched quietly, unsure how to break the heavy silence that hung between them. "You know," Gerald said after a while, "I used to be scared of flying." Jordan glanced at him, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "You?" "Scared." "Terrified," Gerald admitted, leaning back in his seat. "The first time I got on a plane, I thought I was going to lose my mind. But then someone told me something that helped." "What?" Jordan asked, curiosity breaking through his somber mood. "They said, you don't have to control everything, just trust the plane to do its job." Gerald shrugged. "It sounds silly, but it helped me let go. Sometimes you just have to trust that things will work out." Jordan turned back to the window, his expression thoughtful. "What if they don't?" Gerald hesitated, then placed a hand on the boy's arm. "Then you find a way to keep going. That's what your dad would want. That's what Ryan would have wanted." The mention of Ryan slipped out before Gerald could stop himself, and for a moment, the air between them felt heavier. But Jordan didn't ask, and Gerald didn't elaborate. Upon their arrival in Switzerland, the crisp air greeted them with a refreshing sensation. The mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks glowing faintly in the afternoon light. A sleek black car waited to take them to the medical facility, its driver standing by the open door with a polite nod. Jordan climbed in first, clutching his backpack to his chest. Gerald followed, the weight of their journey settling deeper with each passing mile. The car sped through winding roads, past rolling hills and quaint villages, until the hospital came into view. A modern building with glass walls that gleamed in the sunlight. Inside, They were greeted by a kind-faced doctor who introduced herself as Dr. Fisher. Her warm demeanor seemed to ease some of Jordan's tension as she knelt to his level. "Jordan," she said with a gentle smile, "we're going to take excellent care of you here. I know it's a lot to take in, but you're in the best hands." Jordan nodded, his grip on the envelope loosening slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. Dr. Fisher stood and turned to Gerald. "We'll need to run some tests this evening to prepare for tomorrow's treatment. You can stay with him until then." In the sterile hospital room, Jordan sat on the bed, swinging his legs nervously. Gerald pulled a chair closer, his presence steady and grounding. "Do you think Dad's okay?" Jordan asked suddenly, his voice small. Gerald hesitated. "I think he's proud of you," he said. "He knows you're doing this because you're brave, because you're strong." Jordan's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away. "I don't feel strong." "You are," Gerald said firmly. "You've been through more than most people ever will, and you're still here. That's strength." Jordan looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." As the evening wore on, Gerald found himself watching Jordan more closely. The boy's resilience, his quiet courage. It reminded him so much of Ryan. He felt a pang of guilt, wondering if he was trying to fill the void Ryan had left behind. But then Jordan caught him staring and smiled, and Gerald realized it didn't matter. What mattered was being here for Jordan, now. The next morning, the medical team arrived to prepare Jordan for his first round of treatment. The boy clung to Gerald's hand as they wheeled him toward the procedure room, his small frame trembling despite his best efforts to stay calm. "You'll be right here when I'm done?" Jordan asked, his voice quivering. "I'll be here," Gerald promised, his grip firm, "every step of the way." Jordan nodded, his face pale but determined. As the doors swung shut behind him, Gerald stood in the hallway, his heart pounding. Mary's voice echoed in his mind. This is going to be hard. For all of us. He turned toward the window at the end of the corridor, the view of the mountains steadying him. For the first time in years, Gerald felt like he was part of something bigger than his own pain, something worth fighting for. The sterile white corridors of the Swiss hospital felt endless. But after weeks of intensive treatment, hope began to replace the suffocating uncertainty that had followed Gerald and Jordan here. Jordan's recovery was slow but steady, each day bringing a small victory. Color returning to his cheeks, the strength in his voice growing firmer, the light in his eyes sparking again. Gerald spent nearly every waking hour by Jordan's side, his chair a permanent fixture beside the boy's bed. They played card games, watched movies on a small tablet, and shared stories, some light-hearted, some deeper than Gerald had anticipated sharing. Jordan was curious, his questions revealing a sharp mind and a capacity for empathy far beyond his years. "Do you think Dad would be proud of me?" Jordan asked one afternoon, his voice small but steady. Gerald paused, taken aback by the question. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't think he's just proud, Jordan," he said slowly. "I think he's in awe of you. The way you're fighting through this, your strength, it's incredible." Jordan nodded, his gaze dropping to his lap. He fiddled with the edge of the envelope that rarely left his side, the edges now worn and frayed. "I want to make him proud," he whispered, "even if he's not here." Gerald's heart clenched, but he didn't correct Jordan. He couldn't. Not yet. The news of Russell's passing came late one evening, delivered by a nurse with a kind but sorrowful expression. Gerald had stepped outside Jordan's room for a moment of quiet when the call came through. The words struck him deeply, causing him to momentarily lose his breath. "We did everything we could," the nurse said softly. "He passed peacefully." Gerald nodded stiffly, the weight of the loss pressing down on him. He couldn't let Jordan know. Not now. Not while the boy's fragile health depended on every ounce of positivity and strength he could muster. Back in the room, Gerald forced a steady demeanor as Jordan greeted him with a small, worn smile. "Is everything okay?" Jordan asked, tilting his head curiously. "Everything's fine," Gerald replied, his voice calm. "How are you feeling?" Jordan shrugged. "Tired. But better, I think." Gerald sat beside him, the words he couldn't say swirling in his mind. Instead, he picked up the deck of cards they'd been playing with earlier. "Think you're up for another round? I'm still trying to beat you." Jordan grinned faintly, the shadow of fatigue still visible in his eyes. "You have no chance." For the next few days, Gerald shielded Jordan from the truth, focusing instead on helping him regain his strength. Dr. Fisher reported encouraging progress, her updates laced with cautious optimism. Jordan's body was responding well to the treatment, and the boy's spirit seemed to lift with every passing milestone. Gerald finally chose a quiet evening to share the truth with Jordan. The boy sat cross-legged on the hospital bed, the dim glow of the bedside lamp casting soft shadows across his face. Gerald sat in the chair beside him, the letter from Russell in his hand. "Jordan," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "There's something I need to tell you." Jordan's eyes darted to the envelope, then back to Gerald. "Is it about Dad?" Gerald nodded slowly. "Your dad? He passed away a few days ago. I didn't want to tell you until you were feeling stronger." Jordan gazed at him, his face pallid as the words lingered in the air like a jagged blade. "He's gone?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Yes," Gerald said softly, his chest tightening as tears welled in the boy's eyes. "But he wanted you to know how much he loved you, how proud he was of you." Jordan clutched the envelope tightly, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I didn't get to say goodbye." Gerald reached out, placing a steady hand on Jordan's shoulder. "He left this for you," he said, pointing to the letter. "It's his way of saying goodbye." Jordan took the letter with trembling hands, his tears falling freely now. He opened it slowly, his small fingers carefully unfolding the paper. As he read, his expression shifted, grief mingling with something deeper. Love, pride, and the weight of his father's final words. When Jordan finished reading, he pressed the letter to his chest, his eyes closed. "I'm going to make him proud," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'm going to live the life he wanted me to." Gerald nodded, his own eyes damp. "You will, Jordan. I know you will." The days that followed were bittersweet, filled with moments of reflection and quiet determination. Jordan's strength continued to grow, his resilience shining brighter with each step toward recovery. Gerald saw the boy's resolve harden, his focus shifting from the pain of loss to the promise of a future his father had envisioned for him. As they prepared to leave the hospital and return to Chicago, Jordan stood by the window of his room, the letter from Russell tucked safely into his pocket. The snow-capped mountains in the distance seemed to echo his resolve, a silent reminder of the journey he'd endured and the one still ahead. "I'm ready," Jordan said, turning to Gerald with a determined smile. "Let's go home." And with that, Gerald felt a flicker of hope, one not just for Jordan, but for himself as well. Together, they were stepping into a new beginning, one shaped by love, loss, and the courage to keep moving forward. Back in Chicago, the city felt different to Gerald. The bustling streets, the towering skyline, even the familiar hum of life. It all seemed softer, less imposing. Perhaps it was because he wasn't alone anymore. Jordan walked beside him, his steps lighter than they'd been in months, his small frame bundled up against the brisk winter air. There was a sense of quiet resolve between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the road they'd travelled to get here. The first weeks at home were an adjustment. Gerald's house, once cold and devoid of life, began to shift into something else. Jordan's laughter occasionally echoed through the halls as he explored the space, his presence filling the void that had lingered since Ryan's death. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of everything, Russell's absence, the pressure of responsibility, the memories of Ryan, threatened to overwhelm Gerald. But Jordan's resilience anchored him, pulling him back each time. One morning, over a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, Gerald broached the topic he'd been considering since their return. "Jordan," he began, setting his coffee cup down, "I've been thinking about something." Jordan looked up from his plate, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Gerald hesitated, then smiled softly. "I'd like to adopt you, if that's something you want too." The boy's eyes widened, his fork hovering mid-air. "You mean, like, officially?" "Officially," Gerald confirmed. "You'd be my son, in every way that matters." Jordan's lips trembled as he set his fork down. He looked at Gerald, his expression a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "A lot." Gerald reached across the table, resting his hand over Jordan's smaller one. "Then it's settled. We're a family now." Mary's visits became more frequent, her presence as constant as it was comforting. She often stopped by after work, bringing meals and spending time with Jordan. The boy had taken to calling her Aunt Mary, though the maternal instinct she displayed suggested something deeper. Gerald watched her interactions with Jordan, her warmth and patience, and found himself wondering if the barriers they'd built between them could ever truly come down. One evening, after Jordan had gone to bed, Gerald and Mary sat in the living room, a shared silence stretching between them. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "You've changed," Mary said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "Since I first saw you at the hospital. You're different." Gerald turned to her, his expression contemplative. "I think Jordan changed me," he admitted. "Or maybe he reminded me of who I used to be." Mary smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "He's lucky to have you, and you're lucky to have him." The conversation hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Gerald wanted to say more, to bridge the gap that had formed between them. But the moment passed, and Mary stood to leave. "Good night, Gerald," she said softly, her eyes lingering on him for a moment, before she walked out the door. As the months went on, life settled into a new rhythm. Gerald found himself embracing his role as Jordan's father, navigating the challenges and joys of parenthood with a growing confidence. They worked through the boy's grief together, Gerald offering the same steady reassurance that Russell had asked of him. One afternoon, while sorting through some of Russell's belongings that had been sent to them, Jordan found a small notebook filled with sketches and scribbled ideas. He brought it to Gerald, his eyes shining with excitement. "Look," he said, flipping to a page where Russell had outlined an idea for a foundation. Something to support families dealing with medical hardships. Gerald took the notebook, his throat tightening as he read the notes. "Russell's Hope," he murmured, seeing the name scribbled in the margins. Jordan nodded eagerly. "We should do it, for Dad." Gerald looked at the boy, his heart swelling with pride. "I think that's a fantastic idea," he said. "We'll make it happen." The foundation became a shared mission, something that brought Gerald, Jordan, and Mary even closer. They spent evenings brainstorming ideas, reaching out to contacts, and sketching out the vision Russell had dreamed of. For Gerald, it was more than just a project. It was a way to honor his friend and ensure that Jordan had a legacy to carry forward. At the launch event for Russell's Hope, Jordan stood on a small stage, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This foundation is for my dad," he said, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "It's for families like ours, who need hope when things feel impossible. My dad believed in helping people, and I want to keep that going." Gerald stood off to the side, his chest tight with emotion. Mary stood beside him, her hand brushing against his briefly. He glanced at her, and for a moment he saw the glimmer of the life they might still build together. As Jordan finished his speech to a wave of applause, Gerald felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just a new beginning for Jordan. It was for all of them. A family rebuilt, not through blood, but through love, resilience, and the shared promise of a better future. The sun cast a golden glow over the cemetery, its rays filtering through the bare branches of winter trees. The air was crisp, but not biting, as Gerald, Jordan, and Mary stood quietly in front of two gravestones. Russell's grave was adorned with a modest plaque that bore his name and the words, "A loving father and friend." Beside it was Ryan's resting place, marked by a small angel statue and the inscription, "Forever loved, forever missed." Jordan knelt by Russell's grave, his fingers brushing the cold stone. He had insisted on carrying a bouquet of bright yellow daisies, Russell's favorite flower. Carefully, he arranged them at the base of the marker, his movements deliberate and reverent. "Hi, Dad," Jordan said softly, his voice steady, despite the tears glistening in his eyes. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for believing in me, for making me strong enough to get through this. I'm going to make you proud. I promise." He paused, glancing over at Ryan's grave. "And Ryan, I didn't get to know you, but I feel like I do. Gerald told me stories about you. I hope we can be friends, somehow." Gerald felt his breath tighten as he observed the boy. Jordan's words carried a quiet bravery, a reflection of the strength Russell had instilled in him. Gerald stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on Jordan's shoulder. "You've come so far," Gerald said, his voice low but full of pride. "Your dad would be proud of the man you're becoming." Jordan turned to look up at him, his face breaking into a small but genuine smile. "Thanks, Gerald. I mean, Dad." The word hung in the air, heavier than Gerald expected, but it filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Mary stood a few steps back, her arms crossed against the slight chill in the air. She watched the interaction between Gerald and Jordan, her expression a mixture of pride and quiet longing. As Gerald turned toward her, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding of the journey they had traveled together. "Do you think they're watching us?" Jordan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Mary stepped forward, her voice gentle. "I think they're always with us, Jordan. In the things we do, the people we help. They live on in the choices we make." Jordan nodded thoughtfully, looking back at the graves. "Then I'm going to make beneficial choices for them." Later that afternoon, the three of them sat in Gerald's car, the radio playing softly in the background as they drove through the winding streets of Chicago. The city felt alive, its pulse steady and welcoming, a stark contrast to the chaos it had once represented in Gerald's life. "I was thinking," Jordan said from the back seat, his voice tentative but excited. "Russell's hope is great, but what if we add something, like a program for kids who don't have dads, to help them find someone they can look up to?" Gerald glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his heart swelling with pride. "That's a fantastic idea, Jordan. You're already thinking like a leader." Mary smiled from the passenger seat, turning slightly to face Jordan. "You have a big heart," she said warmly. "Your dad would love that." The conversation flowed easily, the miles slipping by as they talked about plans for the Foundation's future. Jordan's excitement was infectious, and for the first time in years, Gerald felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own pain. As the sun began to set, Gerald parked the car near Lake Michigan. The water stretched out before them, reflecting the vibrant hues of the sky. They stepped out, the crisp wind tugging at their coats, and stood together at the edge of the lake. Jordan leaned against the railing, his hands in his pockets. "You know," he said, glancing at Gerald and Mary, "I think this is the best I've felt in a long time." Gerald placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've been through a lot, Jordan, and you've come out stronger. That's what matters." Mary's hand brushed lightly against Gerald's as she moved closer, and he didn't pull away. Instead, he turned to her, their gazes locking for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Gratitude, hope, and something deeper flickered between them, unspoken but undeniable. As they stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear over the horizon, Gerald felt a profound sense of peace. His journey wasn't over, but he wasn't walking it alone anymore. He had Jordan, whose resilience inspired him daily, and Mary, whose presence reminded him of the love and connection he thought he'd lost forever. The open road ahead seemed less daunting for the first time in years. It seemed full of promise. Gerald was certain that the best was still to come as he gazed at Jordan. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining.